Thank you for that great welcome. I feel like we're done here. We can just move on. That was terrific. And I love the beach reading idea. Actually, as Fiona mentioned, the book has been optioned by HBO for a 6-part series. Hopefully it'll get made. The executive producer is Bradley Cooper, who called me up one day out of the blue and said he had read the book and wanted to do something, wanted to make a film out of it. And he had actually read the book on the beach in Tahiti, not in Bali, with his supermodel Russian girlfriend. And apparently got so engrossed in the book, he ignored her for part of the vacation. She was really angry. But he got back to Washington, and he called me up, and we sat and we talked for about 3 hours. He sat on my couch in my house in suburban D.C. and told me how he had this great vision for making the book into a film. So very excited about that. Hope it happens. So 364 days. Where'd Nikolai go? I didn't realize it's been quite that long since we started this process of trying to get back here. Actually, it was in the summer we finally committed to a date, and I was thinking this is going to be early December when I was going to come here, and I'm thinking, like, a month after the election, I'm coming to Happy Town in December. So this is going to be lots of happy faces, the sound of construction going on in the new wing of the Clinton Library, and turned out none of that's going to happen, but unless we're all victims of the world's greatest fake news story. But we're going to get through this, and we're at the Washington Post, we're just thinking this is the time for us all to step up and do our jobs as journalists and citizens and hold our leaders to account. And I hope you're all with us with that struggle, and pay attention to real news and real fact-checking, and don't get distracted by the other stuff that's out there. So we're going to talk today about a subject that everybody here already knows a lot about. Some of you really know quite a lot about it, and Fiona certainly does, studying this as she does. But some of you would rather not ever hear about these crazy people ever again, and that's certainly understandable too. But I'm going to argue today, and the point of this presentation is to explain that this is a group that's going to affect your life. And it's not because they're going to blow something up down at the River Market sometime in the next few weeks. It's because they're affecting our political culture, and they've already started to do that. We just had an election, as we were joking about just a few weeks ago. A very important factor in that election was ISIS. It wasn't discussed at every rally, but believe me, as someone who goes around the country talking about ISIS, people are frightened by this group, sometimes inordinately frightened by this group. They're very unsettled by the pictures they see on TV, the beheadings and these terrible deeds they see this group does, and the randomness of the violence they perpetrate. So people do care about this, and it's affecting our political culture, not just here in the United States, but in Europe. And I've spent a lot of time talking to French and German and Belgian leaders, and they're all very much concerned about ISIS, and it's very much changing the way that people think and the way they vote. So as we look back at this last election that we had and the fear that sort of came out of that, it struck me that we had candidates that talked a lot about ISIS when they had the opportunity. One of them essentially claiming that he was going to defeat ISIS very quickly and very easily, although he never let on how exactly he was planning to do that. Some of the specific things that came out of his mouth were really more troubling than reassuring, because there was a claim that Trump knew more about ISIS than the generals, that President Obama started ISIS, and sort of talk like that. And then some of the specifics that we heard were also a little bit troubling, such as the suggestion that we should kill family members of terrorists and do things that would actually make the problem worse. So, the reason I want to talk about ISIS is because we need an extremely thorough understanding of this organization if we're going to defeat it. We need to know how it started, what it's doing, what its goals are, because the wrong prescription can make the disease even worse. And that's something I want you to think about as we look at some pictures and talk about ISIS and where it came from over the next few minutes. I'm going to start with kind of a Cliff Notes version. This is kind of like a 3-minute video presentation that just gives a bit of an overview of ISIS and kind of highlights the things we're going to talk about in the next few minutes. So here's our little Cliff Notes version of the rise of ISIS.
والله لتهزمن أمريكا في العراق بسلاحها بعون الله تعالى. الله أكبر.
1-7 تحت العاصي. شعب حماه بأكمله في تحت العاصي. شعب الصليبية والله لك يوما بإذن الله كيوم فرنسا، فوالله إن كنا قد دكينا فرنسا في عقر دارها في باريس فقسما بأمر الله لندكن أمريكا وبعقرها في واشنطن بإذن الله تعالى.
Please, you're too kind for my PowerPoint skills here, but thank you for that. So my book, it really is a story of origins. It's a character sketch that digs into the histories of some of the men that built ISIS. We're actually going to talk about 5 personalities today that tell the story of ISIS. It all starts with al-Zarqawi, the man who's probably the most important and most innovative terrorist personality of the last 2 decades, second only to Osama bin Laden. We're going to continue on to some other individuals that may not be as familiar to you, but they're very important to understanding what we're up against with this foe. We start with Zarqawi because he is the founder, the godfather, the pioneer of many of the tactics that ISIS uses today, including beheadings of young men in orange jumpsuits splashed all over the internet. Zarqawi was an original and indispensable force. ISIS literally would not exist without him, and in a strange way, Zarqawi would not have existed without us. So if you want to understand Zarqawi or ISIS, this is a great place to start. So every terrorist starts out, even a terrorist starts out life as a cute little kid. Here he is with his mom back around 1968. The point is, he wasn't a cute little kid. He was a bad seed from the beginning. He was in constant trouble from the time he was a very young kid in middle school. And it wasn't just Tom Sawyer mischief. He was the kind of kid that would cut other kids with razor blades and knives. He did drugs. He was vicious. Absolutely headed for trouble. By the time he was in high school, he was a dropout. He had an extensive criminal record. And he had tattoos, he was a drinker, anything but a religious man. And then he gets a religious conversion. His mom sends him to the local mosque to take classes. Thanks a lot, Mom. So suddenly he gives up his drinking and becomes very pious. And like other young Muslim men his age, he does something that a lot of guys did in the 1980s. He decides to travel to Afghanistan to join the jihad. And this is really the cradle of the modern jihadist movement, the proving ground for al-Qaeda and all the other groups you're familiar with. But Zarqawi fails even in Afghanistan because he arrives too late to fight the Russians. So he joins the Arab army that's fighting the Afghan communist government, and this violent young man discovers that, surprise, he's very good at killing people. He's a ferocious fighter, and he has this religious fervor that's being pumped up as well because he's learning at the feet of a generation of Islamist radicals led by Osama bin Laden. But then the war ends for him, and he goes back home to sleepy Jordan, a peaceful place, a moderate place, a place where he no longer feels at home. He forms a cell, and he starts looking for ways to attack symbols of Western corruption, to keep the jihad thing going. And he doesn't have many things to do in Jordan, so they start looking at liquor stores and pornographic theaters. In fact, one of the big achievements they had back in those days was they sent a guy into an X-rated theater to blow the place up. So a guy walks in with his bomb, sits down, and starts watching the movie, gets totally engrossed and forgets all about the bomb. So the bomb blows up at his feet, the guy loses both his legs, nobody else gets hurt, and this is the kind of knuckleheads we're dealing with back in the 90s. But the Jordanians eventually get tired of al-Zarqawi, they throw him in prison, and this becomes the second phase of his transformation. So he's a religious criminal, now he's in jail, with a lot of company, because the Jordanians had a big problem. They had all these young men who had went off to Afghanistan to fight in the war. They all came back home and they want to start this jihadist thing back home. So perhaps unwisely, the Jordanians decide to put them all together, to keep the religious guys separated so they don't infect the rest of the population. But in this setting, stuck in these harsh conditions, a movement is formed. The prison becomes a kind of jihadi university, and Zarqawi, the tough guy, this guy with all the swagger and all this battle experience, begins to distinguish himself as a charismatic and capable leader. This is where Zarqawi gets the first of a couple of incredible breaks in his life. He was supposed to have been in prison until 2009. He would have been in his late middle age. He would have been locked up all that time. And nobody ever would have heard of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi if that had happened. But then in 1999, something happens. Jordan's king dies. The King Hussein passes away. And in Jordan, there's a tradition when a sovereign dies, there's a general amnesty granted for political prisoners. And so the tribes get together, parliament gets together, they come up with a really long list of people they want to get freed. About 2,000 people end up walking out of jail, and including among them is Zarqawi and almost his entire entourage. So Zarqawi leaves Jordan and heads off to the one place where he had fond memories, and that was Afghanistan, hoping to reunite with his old hero Osama bin Laden. Interestingly, bin Laden wants nothing to do with him, because even at this young age, Zarqawi is considered too much of a hardhead, too much of a wild card, even for the mastermind of 9/11. So bin Laden basically tells him to get lost, gives him some money, says, go off, you start your own thing, but we don't want anything to do with you. So he's essentially denied membership in al-Qaeda. So off he goes to western Afghanistan, starts his own little camp, and again, nobody would have ever heard of Zarqawi if history had not intervened again. Fiona mentioned this briefly, but in 2003, Secretary of State Colin Powell gets before the United Nations to make the case for an invasion of Iraq. And there are two pillars, there are two sort of rationales for the war, as you all remember. One was WMD, Saddam Hussein might have weapons of mass destruction, so that was one pillar. The second was this possibility that al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein might somehow collude together. What if Saddam had these bad weapons and he gave it to al-Qaeda and they did something even worse than 9/11? But there's not much evidence that any relationship exists, because al-Qaeda and sort of a secularist tyrant really don't have much to do with each other. But Colin Powell, interestingly, talks about this obscure terrorist named Zarqawi, somebody that I remember covering the story at the time. We all ran off to our computers to try to figure out who the heck he's talking about. But here he is on the screen. This is the actual photo that went before the UN Security Council, suggesting that Zarqawi is this poster child for this connection between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda, this very dangerous, nexus that the Bush administration was saying existed. Turns out there are two problems with this story or this claim. One was it wasn't true at all. There was no connection between Zarqawi and Saddam Hussein. Intelligence operatives on the Iraqi side were actually trying to spy on Zarqawi and figure out what he was up to the same way we were. They didn't have any kind of practical dealings with him at all. And the second thing, it made Zarqawi an overnight sensation, because the United States Secretary of State said he was an important guy, said he was dangerous, said he was a big deal. Jihadists all around the world believed it too. So suddenly he's getting followers, he's getting money, he's getting weapons, and then he moves himself into Iraq to await the arrival of U.S. troops. And so when the war starts in 2003, Zarqawi's there, not bin Laden, but Zarqawi is there with his little army ready to cause problems for the Americans when they arrive. And so when he shows up, he actually has a couple of very smart things he does right away. He starts to build alliances with important people, including some of the thousands of Iraqi army officers, intelligence officers, members of the political elite there who no longer had jobs. Because as you recall, the U.S. administration dismantled the Ba'athist, dismantled the army, sent everybody home. These guys didn't even have pensions anymore. And so they're looking to fight back, they're looking to start something, and here's this Jordanian hothead who's a bit of a fanatic but has resources and has big ambitions, and they start to form a nucleus around him. The second thing he starts to do is do some very strategic and very impressive, as we look back in history, bombings on some key targets. He starts going after embassies, particularly Arab embassies. He goes after, this is the UN headquarters in 2003, blows the place up, kills the head of the UN mission, goes after the Red Cross, starts sending home anybody who could actually help us. Anybody could give the US a cover of legitimacy for the occupation. He begins to drive them away. Then, second prong of his strategy was to start to attack the Sunni-Shia fault line. As most of us know, there are two major branches of Islam in Iraq. There's the Sunni and the Shia. The Shia are the the majority, and sort of the downtrodden, so have been sort of misused or mistreated by the Sunni minority for years. But he starts attacking their mosques and blowing them up. He starts killing their religious leaders. He starts attacking regular Shiite civilians in their homes, in their mosques, in their schools, and starts just waves of bloodshed. So if you look back at what he did, essentially he drove away everybody who could help the U.S., then he ignites a civil war and puts us right in the middle of it. So next thing you know, we're being shot at by all sides, and Zarqawi has essentially created or succeeded as his mission of creating mass chaos, of tearing the country apart. Okay, so this was a pretty smart strategy overall. And because of his success, he gets a lot of followers. About 10,000 people from around the Middle East and from North Africa, from the Arab countries, come to Iraq to join his movement. So he's got a pretty big army suddenly. And he's so successful that bin Laden can no longer ignore him. So bin Laden strikes a deal with him, lets him create an al-Qaeda franchise, which is where the name al-Qaeda in Iraq comes from, and just essentially acknowledges that this is a big deal. This is proto-ISIS, al-Qaeda in Iraq, this thing that he started. But it turns out Zarqawi had a very different notion of what jihad should look like. Against bin Laden's advice, he starts to do some really terrible, brutal things. He comes to understand that no bombing, no shooting, no usual act of terrorism can summon up the kind of visceral dread as watching a person being killed in a brutal way on the internet. So the beheadings that we're also used to now. So he finds some American kid who happened to be trying to start a business in Iraq, kidnaps him, puts him in an orange jumpsuit. That's Zarqawi with the black hood on behind him reading from the script. And Zarqawi takes out a knife and with his own hand, he executes this young man and then puts the image on the internet, in which suddenly it's downloaded into millions of homes. This is 2004, so broadband internet is becoming very common. This is a moment where lots of people started seeing the terrible things going on in Iraq and beginning to sour on the whole American experience there and thinking that maybe this is a bad place for us to be, this is not worth our time. And so that wasn't the only difference with Zarqawi. He starts to launch a kind of media campaign, taking advantage of the internet with himself at the center, using social media platforms that were just becoming available. So now you have this contrast between the old gray-bearded bin Laden who's reading boring sermons from a script and droning on for hours versus this jihadist action figure, this guy looks like a ninja with a machine gun who kills Americans with his own hand. And jihadists around the world are eating this up. They think it's great stuff. He's also brash enough to make up his own rules. Zarqawi doesn't understand theology because he can barely read. So he's not really constrained by the Quran. He doesn't really care what proper Islam is. He does his own thing and he justifies it after the fact. So it's okay to him that he can deploy legions of suicide bombings, even though that's a bit problematic for the Quran because you're not really supposed to kill yourself if you're a good Muslim. It's okay to burn people alive, even though that's strictly forbidden by the Quran. But it's okay if you don't understand the Quran very well, you just do it anyway and justify it later. So he even starts to think about this really revolutionary idea, a big idea of restoring the ancient caliphate, these old empires from Islam's past. And he regards himself as being divinely appointed to usher in this new age of ultra-pure, ultra-conservative Islam by driving the West out and by brutally destroying everyone that stands in its way, from corrupt governments to apostate sects like the Shiites. And this creation of the caliphate, in his mind, was not just going to be sort of the beginning of this new moment in history, but it was going to be the beginning of the end of history. He saw himself as ushering in Armageddon, the great climactic battle between the forces of good and evil. And it even predicted where it was going to take place. This final battle was going to happen in Syria. And he said of himself, I am the spark. I am the one that's going to make all this happen. So spoiler alert here, for those of you who haven't read the book, Zarqawi doesn't live to see any of this. By now, he's enemy number one for the U.S. forces in Iraq, and we poured vast resources into the effort to stop him. It took us nearly 3 years because he was really good at hiding, he was really good security, but eventually our intelligence and special forces found the formula for defeating Zarqawi and his network. It started with good intelligence. We discovered his hideout. We had good informants. We used our air power. We didn't send legions of troops in after him, but we dropped a bomb on his house and killed him. We started getting support from Iraqi tribes who were finally sick of these radicals and were ready to join our side. We had this thing called the Anbar Awakening in the mid-2000s. And so by 2009, Zarqawi was dead. Most of his followers were dead. The ones that were left were in deep hiding, and al-Qaeda was essentially beaten by 2008. But not exactly, not entirely. Here's our second ISIS personality. We know him as Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. This is a picture of him when he was in a U.S. prison camp in 2004. This is the leader of ISIS as we know it today. In Zarqawi's time, nobody would have pictured this man as a possible leader because he was Zarqawi's opposite. He was kind of shy, bookish. He was a scholar. He had a doctorate degree in Islamic law. He was on track to becoming a college professor when the U.S. invasion took place in 2003. He joined Zarqawi's gang as a religious advisor, and after Zarqawi's death, he began rising through the ranks as other leaders around him were being killed. So by 2010, this decimated organization was made up mostly of former Iraqi officers with a few jihadis. They needed a new kind of figurehead at the top of their organization, and Baghdadi is it. He's an Islamic scholar. He happens to be from a tribe that claims to descend from the Prophet Muhammad, so he has religious credentials. And this is important for a group that's calling itself not just a branch of al-Qaeda, but they're starting to call themselves a state. The state in the early days, when they call themselves the Islamic State of Iraq, the state is kind of a joke because, even to these guys and their families, they didn't really have a state. One of the leader's wives reacts to the new name with derision. "What's this state you're talking about?" she says. "We're living in a desert." But then history intervenes in ISIS's favor a second time. Just as Baghdadi is coming to power, U.S. troops are pulling out of Iraq under an agreement struck during the Bush administration. As soon as they're gone, the Iraqi government, Shiite government, feels emboldened to start settling old scores with the Sunni tribes. They start arresting their leaders, kicking out Sunni army officers, and so much of the Sunni population begins to rebel against the Baghdad government, and there's common cause being struck between these Sunni tribes and a Sunni terrorist group that calls itself the Islamic State of Iraq. And then, a year later, civil war breaks out in Syria. And Baghdadi sees an opportunity, and he moves his people into Syria to restart his militia movement. They now have a perfect incubator, a lawless state, awash in violence and weapons. And they have a new reason to exist, because they have this oppressive tyrant, this dictator, Bashar al-Assad, a man who's stirring up passions all over the Sunni world by slaughtering Arab citizens. So they rename themselves yet again. Now they're called the Islamic State of Iraq, or al-Sham, or ISIS. And they're extraordinarily successful almost immediately because they're the best fighters on the rebel side. They start to attract foreign recruits by the thousands. And by 2014, they're ready to break out, and they do so in dramatic fashion. They capture most of eastern Syria, then they invade western Iraq to declare the establishment of an Islamic caliphate. By the summer of that year, ISIS is a powerhouse, 30,000 strong, able to capture entire Iraqi cities and overrun entire divisions of U.S.-trained Iraqi troops. This is the ISIS we're all so familiar with today. But what is it like, really? What are the advantages and the strengths that it has today that it didn't have back in Zarqawi's time? For one thing, they're quite rich. Still today, they're quite rich. After its stunning capture of Mosul 2 years ago, ISIS became the wealthiest and best armed terrorist group of all time. They owned oil wells. They owned entire bank vaults with hundreds of millions of dollars of hard currency. They have universities. They have resources that al-Qaeda never dreamed of having. And yet, in some ways, they're very much like the founder, very much like Zarqawi with a few twists. Zarqawi embraced violence for its own sake to cause tension to himself and to provoke and shock. ISIS does the same thing, but on a much grander scale, using tactics that even al-Qaeda finds disgusting. It uses violence to excite the base, to intimidate opponents, and to cow everybody else into submission. And under Baghdadi, the religious scholar, ISIS goes out of its way to try to create theological arguments to justify its actions. This was a problem during Zarqawi's time. He didn't really care what the Quran said, he just did it anyway. But because the head of ISIS today, an Islamic scholar, they find a little passage here or a little verse here in some obscure text that will justify pretty much anything they want to do. So they can claim to be pious Muslims even though they're anything but that. Zarqawi also understood the power of social media. He understood that horror can be amplified on a massive scale using the internet. And ISIS today, 10 years later, has just gotten better at it. They're extraordinarily good at harnessing the power of social media as a vehicle for recruitment, for screening, for indoctrination, for training, all of which can be done at a distance before the prospective recruit sets foot in Syria. But instead of a shaky handheld camera that Zarqawi was using back in his day, these guys have whole teams of professionals. So these terrible videos you see on the internet, it's not just one guy with a camera, it's 4 or 5 guys taking the shot from different angles, and they go back to a studio with advanced equipment, and they remix it and they add fancy graphics, all of it packaged to appeal to a group of young people of military age who grew up on Call of Duty and other kinds of Warcraft games. So this formula has worked very well for ISIS, as we've seen, and to the extent that they've become this incredible attraction to people who were like-minded jihadists or just people who just wanted to have an adventure. There's a million reasons people have joined ISIS, but all told, about 35 to 40,000 people have come from outside the region, not Iraqis or Syrians, but people from other places have migrated to join this movement. That's a bigger number than all the people that joined al-Qaeda in Afghanistan back in the 1980s, more than joined Zarqawi's army in the 2000s, more than those two groups combined. The movement has metastasized. In a year in which there are many ISIS, there are tiny ISIS states called wilayats in 9 countries, and at least a dozen others. They have cells, including in Northern Europe. There are 5,000 ISIS recruits from Europe alone, so there's been quite a diaspora from there. And which brings us to quickly to our next personality that defines ISIS today. You may not recognize his face, but you'll remember what he did. This is Abdul Hamid Aboud, and he's the 28-year-old Belgian national who led the terrorist attack in Paris last November that killed 130 people. His background actually is interesting because it's a typical prototype of Northern Europeans who join ISIS. The son of Muslim immigrants in North Africa, a troubled youth just like Zarqawi was, well known to police. He lived in a slum made up of lower middle-class Muslim immigrants. He was a kid that didn't seem to fit in his own society, either as a religious Muslim or as a modern citizen in his family's adopted country. So he ended up being radicalized in prison, just like Zarqawi was, and when he joined ISIS, he was able to do 2 things he had never done before. He had a sense of belonging, and he also had a cause, something that would allow him, this misbehaved misfit, to feel as though his life counted for something. So he travels to Syria, where he's a little distressed in the beginning by the bloodshed he's seeing, but within a few months, he's fully with the program, and he's posting videos of himself dragging corpses behind a car. He becomes a key coordinator for ISIS's attacks in Europe, and we all remember what happened in Paris last year, which is his biggest and final assignment. 2 things that are important to consider when you think about his story. He is emblematic of a population that is particularly vulnerable to ISIS's message. Nearly almost always second generation, so not the people who initially immigrate from these other countries, but usually their children, in some cases their grandchildren, but this is second generation are the most problematic. He feels conflicted about his identity. He's not well integrated in the society where he lives. He's struggling personally. He doesn't feel he has a sense of purpose or a future. He's looking for meaning and adventure, and ISIS seems to fill all those needs. The second key point to think about when you look at this guy's picture is a primary reason that ISIS carries out attacks abroad is it wants young people like Aboud to feel even more alienated. The more countries feel threatened by ISIS, the greater their tendency to crack down on young Muslims like Aboud, to profile them, to harass them, to make them feel even more alienated. And how do we know this? Well, how do we know this is ISIS's strategy? Because they tell us that. Just before the attacks in Paris last November, ISIS's English language magazine put out an article that talked about what it called the gray zone in Europe. Many of the millions of Muslims in Europe are already conflicted about their identity, and ISIS wants to force them to choose sides. The article says Muslims in the West will quickly find themselves between one of two choices. They'll either apostatize and adopt the infidel religion, or they'll emigrate to the Islamic State and thereby escape persecution. So this is a binary choice as ISIS sees it, and it welcomes our help in the West in driving Muslims into their corner. For us in the West, the solutions that sometimes seem easiest and most politically palatable often are the ones that can put you in a much deeper hole. One fourth personality, wrapping up here, is one who was never a member of ISIS, yet all of us associate Omar Mateen, this is the Orlando shooter, with the Islamic State. This is the young man that walked into the Pulse nightclub last June in Orlando and killed 49 people in the worst mass shooting in the U.S. history. Mateen told police he did it for ISIS. To date, there's no evidence that he was ever in contact with ISIS. In fact, the statements that he put out suggest he had a very limited grasp of ISIS's beliefs, and he talks about al-Qaeda as well, even though al-Qaeda and ISIS are essentially at war with each other. But ISIS gets credit for that attack anyway, and it becomes a talking point in our political discourse. Same thing happened again just a week ago at Ohio State University. You know, an incident there, the guy who claimed to be doing it for ISIS or was looking at ISIS literature online. ISIS claims that he's their soldier. As far as we know, there was no real connection between this man and ISIS ever. They still get credit for this deed. Here's what's interesting to me about Mateen's story. He fits again exactly the profile of the Northern European ISIS recruit, the son of Muslim immigrants, second generation, a man in his 20s with a troubled background, unable to find personal success in his life, feeling excluded and persecuted by the dominant culture, embracing extremist ideology as a way to feel empowered and important. Even more striking to me is the fact that the Mateen fits another disturbing profile of a typical perpetrator of the American mass shooting event. There's an interesting piece in the Post a few weeks ago that makes this point. It notes that Islamist terrorists like Mateen share many of the same traits as regular mass killers, if we can call them regular. Almost all of them are young men who have struggled to fit in within their communities. They feel alienated and persecuted in some way, and they have some boastfulness and some craving for attention. It's the same profile, for example, as Dylan Roof, the young South Carolina man who killed 9 African Americans in that church last year in Charleston. One expert in this article makes the observation, Omar Mateen has more in common with Dylan Roof than he does with Osama bin Laden. ISIS just offers a certain young man a different kind of excuse for carrying out their revenge fantasies. This is all pretty dark stuff, so I hate to be depressing, so I do like to end with a little bit of reasons for hope about the fight for ISIS going forward. If you're following the news at all, you know that things are actually going relatively well in Iraq right now. We're making big progress in the battle against Mosul. It's slow. ISIS is waging a determined resistance, and it's been street by street, but there's 100,000 forces arrayed against about 5,000 inside the city of 5,000 defenders in Mosul. So ISIS is going to lose the Battle of Mosul, and they're going to lose their capital in Syria as well. We see other successes. This gives you a kind of an overview of where their territory was. Everything essentially that's colored on the map was once part of ISIS. The parts that are red or dark red have been retaken or now in the hands of the Syrian rebels or the Iraqis. So the caliphate itself has shrunk by about half in Iraq and about a third in Syria. In fact, ISIS is telling its potential recruits in Europe, don't bother to come here anymore because just stay where you are and we'll try to find things for you to do in your homeland instead of coming here to fight. Another place where we're actually having success is in the battle for public opinion. This is actually measuring the views of British Muslim youth between 2014 and 2015, and could see that the people who had a favorable or somewhat favorable view of ISIS dropped pretty dramatically in a year's time. What is a little less comforting is the fact that you still have a not insignificant number of people who still think that ISIS is fine, and if you extrapolate against the number of British youth in that country, that's still a fairly large number of people. A few other good bits of news. We're seeing more and more participation by by Sunni Arabs in the battle. Most of the successes we're seeing in Mosul right now are being won by Iraqi troops. Other countries in the region are pitching in as well, particularly Jordan, which flies probably more sorties every day against ISIS than anyone except for the United States. It's always much better to have Iraqis and Jordanians and other Sunni Arabs fighting this fight instead of Americans as the face of the fight against ISIS. There's more and more in the Islamic community a call for a reformation, for revolution. There's not enough of these voices yet, but you see people like the King of Jordan, Abdullah, has created this process he calls the Amman message, in which he brings together the leaders of all branches of the Islamic faith, from Sunnis to Shias to Sufis and all others, and to get behind a message of tolerance. Maybe not agreeing on all the details, but saying once and for all, this is what we are not. We are not barbarians. We don't kill innocent people. Trying to reclaim the religion from the crazies or the renegades is the word he uses for it. And President al-Sisi of Egypt has done the same thing. A man who's no Democrat. We have problems with many of his policies, but he marched down to Al-Azhar University in Cairo, which is the center of Sunni Islam in the Sunni world, and just singled out the leader of the school and said, you have to stop this. We all have to work together to bring back, to reclaim our religion, and just not just on the level of the university, but on the level of the mosques, and trying to help educate people what a good, faithful Muslim is and what he is not. A final, just in closing here, I'm going to mention one other person, one other ISIS figure that makes it a little bit hard for me to be optimistic about defeating this ideology, at least in the near term. So this fifth personality, his name is Taim. He's only 8 years old, so we didn't take his picture. And we met him actually in a refugee camp in Germany. He's one of tens of thousands of young children who lived under ISIS in towns and villages across the caliphate. Taim is this bright, beautiful young boy who happened to live in the city of Raqqa, Syria, when ISIS took over in 2014 or 13. Within months, he was in an ISIS training camp, getting indoctrinated, learning how to shoot a gun. He was taught that his parents were bad Muslims and he should report on their misbehavior. He was forced to witness all kinds of atrocities, including public executions, and in a few cases, some of his friends were forced to participate in executions. He talked to us about going to a local park and seeing bodies that had been beheaded with their heads stacked up next to them. And every now and then, as we were having this conversation, he began to shut down. He began a little uncomfortable and fidgety. And he asked us at one point to give him a piece of paper and a crayon, and he started just to doodle a little bit. And this is what he drew. This is a picture that he witnessed in his hometown of an execution. The man on the right, you see, the man with one eye, is being dragged before a public square by a man with a knife. And then in the next scene, you see, we're all, as a kid would draw on the same page, there's the same man's head after it's been cut off. And he tried to find the words to describe witnessing this to us, and he kept saying, well, the man's head fell. He was just kind of fixated on that, sort of watching that happen, to see a man's head fall off. And what was troubling to me, just other than just thinking about this poor kid, was thinking about a whole generation of young people who've had similar experiences. And I think about this a lot because when the caliphate does collapse, we as Westerners cannot afford to walk away, because the seeds of countless tragedies are out there right now. Who's going to provide psychological counseling for this young man, Taim? Who's going to rebuild his school? Who's going to offer some kind of hope for a future where he can get a job and a family and some kind of normal life? It's overwhelming to think about the size of the task when you think about the millions of people who've gone through this in the last couple of years. But if we don't find a way to deal with the problem, you can be assured that we're going to be hearing from boys like Taim and girls as well in the future. You can be confident that that kind of extremism and that kind of brutality that we've witnessed in the last 2 years will come back to us again and again. With that, I'll thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take a few questions if you have some.
Hey, Joby, we do have time for some questions. If you raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you. Bob?
Thank you so much for coming. Could you say something about the Arab Spring and whether this exacerbated the situation with ISIS?
You know, I look at Arab Spring as this this horrible missed opportunity. I was a young reporter in my 20s still when the Berlin Wall fell. And I happened to be lucky enough to be a young correspondent working for a wire agency based in Vienna, and I got to see all of it from the front row. I was in Berlin, and then I was in Romania for when Ceausescu was executed. And there's this moment where an entire continent seemed to be like throwing off centuries or decades of history and just emerging into the light. And as we've seen, for a lot of these East Europeans, the experience hasn't turned out to be quite as wonderful as that. But we felt the same way in the early months of the Arab Spring. Here were these young Egyptians protesting and marching down the street, and not like carrying banners of bin Laden. They wanted things that we all want. They wanted freedom of expression. They wanted better job opportunities and things like that. But the problem with Arab Spring was that none of these groups were organized or had sort of the tools, the institutional tools, or the support to be able to pull off the vision that they wanted. So instead, the people who were the most organized, the people who were the strongest and cleverest, were able to hijack this revolution and turn it into a disaster, almost in every country you look at across the region, most particularly in Syria, but also, you just name the country, the experience of Arab Spring has made things worse instead of better. And from ISIS's point of view, what it managed to do was create new tension points between sectarian groups, between Sunnis and Shia. So now they're really all at killing each other. And the second thing is to allow big vacuums to exist that didn't exist before. Syria was, whatever it was before, it was a fairly controlled state where things, people could live a somewhat normal life. That Syria is gone, and it's never coming back again. And in its place, in that hollowed out country, an organization like Zarqawi's old gang, which was almost dead, was able to move back in and create this nightmare that's now affecting the whole world. And so that really is the tragedy, and I think historians continue to dissect this over decades to come. This was this brief flowering of opportunity that has just turned into the worst kind of nightmare that any of us could have conjured up. And we're just beginning to see really the contours of this, because even when the caliphate goes away, and I think by sometime next year, hopefully there will be no more black flags flying over Raqqa or Mosul. But in its place, the same problems will exist, and in many cases, they're going to be even worse, because there's going to be killings, reprisal killings, and just a lack of governance, lack of good governance, so all kinds of opportunities for bad people to come in and do bad things. So I look at the whole thing now as just awful, awful tragedy that we're just beginning to deal with. In the back, yes, sir.
You've hit on it a little bit here with this young boy, but with our current political climate, we don't seem very welcoming of refugees. And if we multiply this young boy times millions, I know Lebanon has over 1 million refugees, and we complain about a few thousand. What can people in the United States do when the political leadership seems to turn its back on the refugees? What's their future? What kind of education are they going to have?
That's an excellent question, and you can understand people's anxiety. And, my family talks about it, over Thanksgiving dinner. People don't want folks kind of streaming across our border who could potentially turn out to be a bad person in 10 years and blow up a school or do some terrible deed. At the same time, the reality on the ground is that we've got millions of people who are fleeing a war zone and have to be addressed in some way. And there are various ways we can do it. We can try to, as the Europeans have tried to do, not very successfully, but take some of them, try to vet them and screen them. Some are allowed to stay, others end up going back home when it's safe to go back home. Others are just being warehoused in these massive camps on the borders of Jordan and Turkey and Lebanon. I've been to these places. They're not good places. And you hear stories all the time, and some of them are verified, of bad guys coming to these camps to sell arms, to recruit, and they're just big festering problems. And it's not just the camps themselves, but countries like Jordan, which is a friend of the United States, peace treaty with Israel, a moderate Sunni Islam country with a fairly enlightened government. They are drowning now in a refugee problem, because there's like 6 million people in Jordan. 1 million of them are refugees. The fourth biggest city in Jordan right now is a refugee camp. And most of the people who are refugees aren't even living in the camps. They've been moved into the cities, little squatter camps here and there, taking jobs that belong to Jordanians, competing for resources. And this is a country that could literally collapse because of a refugee problem. So all I can say is that this is less than prescribing a solution, but just saying this is something we urgently have to deal with. And at the very least, we have to help the countries that are on the front line deal with a problem that's beginning to take them down. Because if we don't, just, systems fail, and also you have essentially more nests for recruitment and for breeding terrorism and other bad things for years to come. It's a huge problem. I've traveled to Europe quite a bit, and this is a problem that literally has changed the political culture there. And then so the smart people know they have to deal with the problem in some way, but they just haven't been able to figure out how to do it. And I don't think we have either. On the front.
I remember reading some analysis that the reason why ISIS was able to thrive for so long was that defeating it wasn't the top priority of any of the powers involved. I mean, the Saudis were more worried about Iran. Iran was more obsessed with the Saudis. Turkey was more worried about the Kurds. The United States just didn't want to get entangled in the Middle East anymore. Yeah. So in this kind of situation, they were just able to do their own thing and thrive. Is that still
absolutely
happening?
Right. I mean, there are several reasons why ISIS was able to gain such a foothold in Syria. And one of them is exactly as you said, that it was no one's priority to deal with these guys. The only one now, you could argue that we're more concerned about defeating ISIS than just about anybody else in the region. The Jordanians have a big problem with ISIS, so they'd like to see them gone too. But for the Saudis, who funneled lots of money and lots of weapons to some of these moderate rebel groups that weren't quite so moderate after all, their big concern is trying to defeat Assad and try to keep the Iranians in check. Everybody's got their little proxy fights going on. The Turks don't like ISIS because ISIS has been blowing up airports and doing bad things in their country, but they're much more concerned about the possibility that Kurdish rebels might gain some military control of the border regions or cause problems for them. So you can see as soon as like Syrian rebels or Kurdish rebels take over a border town, suddenly the Turks get all involved and say, oh no, we're going to occupy that town. This is, or if you don't get out quickly, we're going to fight you too. So nobody really had ISIS as a priority. I think now maybe that's going to change. I can't really say that for certain, but it has not until now been something that the regional powers have been all that concerned about doing. It's somehow, in some ways, particularly for the Iranians, it seems to kind of help them in some crazy way. But good question.
Up front. Microphone's coming behind you. Yeah. Here you go, Walter.
Sure, you're familiar with that article that was in the Atlantic Monthly about what ISIS really wants. It was last year or so.
Yeah, that's a good article.
Have you any comments on that? And if I remember correctly, it was talking about how they were really focused on the caliphate and not so interested in international terrorism.
Yeah, and that was all of our collective view, probably I'd say as recently as mid-2015, that this group really seemed obsessed with the idea of building this caliphate. This is what they wanted to do. And there are even some in the region that argued that, well, let them have their little thing and maybe we can contain them and they'll be okay. But it turns out that from the very beginning, they had designs on doing things outside the region. They weren't content with just having the caliphate. They want the whole Muslim world to be part of their caliphate. And the way that they can do that, essentially to drive Muslims out of their adopted homelands in the West and Europe and North America, and by toppling governments that they consider to be, apostates, like the Jordanian government, the Saudis, name it. They want to see the overthrow of all those places. So they have a foreign operations division. They've got a fairly ambitious agenda for things they want to do around the world. And you could argue now they're not much of a position to do any of that because they're in so much pressure. They may lose the caliphate the next few months, but they anticipate that too. So they've got their little outfit in Afghanistan, which is getting more powerful. They've got cells in Bangladesh and Indonesia. So if one thing goes away, they can claim the caliphate exists somewhere else. So this is still they're very much now a foreign-focused organization, even if it's just to agitate and to sort of prove their own power and the fact that they're still capable, that they're going to continue to want to do things here and not just be contained to the caliphate in Iraq and Syria. But that's been a real change in our own views of this organization in the last few months. Good question.
We have time for one more.
Oh, just any students too, by the way?
Oh,
we'll get one more. We gotta be sure you get a student.
We'll hit one over here.
So you haven't mentioned Iran in your talk today. What's their role in all of this?
Iran has been, it's interesting. In the beginning, you could almost see the glee, particularly among the Israeli officials, because there was all this you see your enemies ganging up and fighting each other and killing each other. It all looked really, really great for a brief period of time. But the Iranians now have benefited in several ways. Their big proxy, Hezbollah, is now much bigger, much more experienced, much better armed, a much more capable force than it ever has been before. They've got, they don't have much of Syria, or Assad doesn't have that much of Syria left, but they do have the major cities, and Iran is in there in force. So they've got their foothold of the region continues. And so this has become for them, it's a proxy war. They appear to be willing to do anything, along with the Russians, anything it takes to keep Assad in power, to hang on to this little part of the world. They spend a lot of money doing it, but it seems to be a huge priority to them. Every week we see Iranian leaders flying into Syria and making statements and rallying the troops. It's been very much a cause for them. And I think in terms of propaganda value within their own country, it's been a big thing. It's been fairly popular. And they're winning in the sense they're going to keep their guy in power. Assad's not going away. He's going to be president of Syria for an indefinite future, whether anybody likes it or not. So I think they've come out of this ahead. Let's take a student. Yeah.
Hi, we recently got back from a Mahdi United Nations conference, and we talked about stopping the spread of ISIS. And I remember that you had mentioned about ISIS's social media power, and what are ways that the Islamic State could that we could regulate ISIS's power over social media?
Yeah, it's been frustrating to a lot of people to see the amount of material that they're able to put out online almost on a daily basis, and we seem powerless to stop it. And it's gotten better, and there are reasons for that, but in the beginning it seemed like they were more nimble than our folks, because you've got people who are on the fly making decisions about what to tweet and what kind of images to put out on social media, about jumping from one platform for another. You get one Twitter account shut down, then you could just move to another. And bureaucracies tend to move much more slowly. So we're always weeks and months behind the curve on trying to figure out what to do, how to respond to these things. The things we have tried have not been very effective. I mean, we tried to put out on our counter message, put out moderate Muslim leaders or people who can kind of give a counter message, but they have no credibility to these young jihadists. They don't look at these moderate religious leaders as being on the right side. So that's been a difficult issue. We've gotten better because we're actually now taking the battle to places where we could do more good. One is working with private industry, working with Facebook, working with Twitter, and they're being much more vigilant about getting stuff off the internet as soon as it's up. And you see it sometimes now within a few minutes. Like some terrible video gets posted, it's available for a brief period of time, then suddenly it disappears because Twitter's got a guy who's watching for the content, and they take it off. The other thing we're getting better at, which is still kind of new but exciting to me, is figuring out how to do what Facebook advertisers do. If you look at shop around for, I don't know, go-karts or something on the internet. After a while, all your Facebook messages have these kind of go-kart advertisements on it. And so we've actually gotten good at doing the same kind of thing. If you're trolling for Islamic hate material or radical messages, then suddenly the social platform that you're in has all these counter messages that seem innocuous enough. It's just some guy who just left the Islamic State, and he thinks they're terrible, and he thinks they're hypocrites, and you see a little video you can click on with his message. And it's very clever and a bit unusual, but we're doing more of that, and you're seeing, in some cases, millions and millions of clicks suggesting that young people are watching these things, and that we're beginning to have this new sort of almost unprecedented ability to reach out directly to people who want to watch this stuff and offering them a different view without it saying property of the U.S. government or property of Jordan or Egypt on it. It's really kind of insidious and clever. So I hope it works. This has been great. I really appreciate everybody's
Joby,
attention.
thank you so much for coming down.
Be here for a bit.
I hope that in 4 years, you and Bradley Cooper can come back and we'll do this again. He does have his book over here if you want to come and continue this conversation. So Joby, thanks again.
Thank you.